Okay, I'm gonna kick us off as people keep trickling in. So my name is Mallory Harris. I'm a third year PhD student in biology at Stanford studying infectious disease modeling. I started this research because I wanted to help develop evidence-based solutions to improving people's health and well-being. But then the COVID-19 pandemic began, and I started to see that despite tremendous uncertainty, in a lot of ways, the issue wasn't a lack of scientific evidence. Instead, it was a misrepresentation of scientific results and political interference in our pandemic response. So, to better understand what was going on, I looked to parallel examples. I read books like The Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, and Triumph of Doubt by David Michaels, which are books that chronicle similar efforts on topics ranging from tobacco to climate change to asbestos. And it can be really frustrating to realize that these tactics keep being deployed and we keep falling for them. But I do think there's also some hope here that by educating ourselves on this relatively limited set of strategies, we can start to recognize them and prevent ourselves from being misled, and then remove some of the barriers to action on some of the most pressing issues we face today. I'm hoping today's webinar can help with that. First, we'll hear from Benjamin Franta, a historian studying the fossil fuel industry's disinformation campaigns to prevent climate action. This will help us to understand the tactics employed to bolster denialism. Next, we'll hear from Larry Au, a sociologist studying trust and doubt of scientific expertise in the context of COVID-19 to understand why denialism catches on. Finally, Stephen Lewandowski will cover links between denialism about climate change and COVID and review strategies to effectively counter these types of efforts. After that, we'll have a Q&A with all of the panelists, so feel free to leave your questions in the chat whenever they come up, and we're hoping to get to as many as possible. So first, I'm going to hand it over to Ben Franta. He is a PhD candidate in history at Stanford University, where he studies the history of climate denial, disinformation, and delay, including their origins, funders, operatives, and strategies. His archival work has found some of the earliest evidence of the fossil fuel industry's internal awareness of links between fossil fuel emissions and global warming, and its intentional circulation of disinformation on the topic. He also analyzes what legal strategies may be effective in holding fossil fuel companies accountable for the effects of their products, and he is doing so by filing amicus briefs in courts across the country. He has a PhD in applied physics from Harvard University and a JD from Stanford Law School. So Ben, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Mallory, and thanks for having me. I feel a little bit like the odd one out because I actually don't know a lot about COVID denial, but I study climate denial. And so I thought I would just share 3 lessons from studying climate denial that might be relevant for COVID denial. And I hope this sort of helps to provide some food for thought. And the first lesson is that ideology is often a front for financial interests. That's what we've seen with climate denial. Climate denialist arguments have often been framed in terms of ideology, things like personal choice or freedom or so on. But we found that the fossil fuel industry has been quietly behind much of that. And big tobacco did the same thing, framing tobacco and addiction in terms of personal freedom and so on. So in this way, ideology can be used to cover financial interests, and an ideology can appear to be more respectable than simply saying we want to make more money. And it also allows these industries that benefit from denial to deflect attention away from themselves and frame the phenomenon as a general societal grassroots one, instead of an organized corporate one. And then, of course, ideological think tanks like Stanford's Hoover Institution and others, they often work as a front as well to sort of intellectually launder those money interests in a kind of intellectual veneer. So that's the first lesson. from climate denial. The second lesson is that some groups and industries fight regulation of their industry by fighting all regulation or the idea of regulation or government action in general. So for example, the Tea Party, which as writer Jeff Nesbitt has shown was actually put together in the 1990s by fossil fuel interests like the Koch brothers and tobacco interests to fight the idea of regulation in general, and then was deployed as a sort of fake grassroots movement around 2008. Another example is that after World War II, big business interests got together to fight the idea that government is competent to do things in general, which, belief in the competence of government was high after World War II, but big business did that in order to shift public sentiment away from trust in government and towards privatization of various roles in society. And if you know about the journalist Amy Westervelt, she's recently produced some great material on that in her podcasts. So the point is that with COVID denial, it's possible that groups or industries not directly implicated by lockdowns could still be involved in organizing denial or fighting the idea of government action in this realm. And I want to be careful because, of course, disentangling the role of ideology and corporate interests it's not something we can just know at the beginning without studying it. It's an empirical task. And with climate denial, that connection remained relatively hidden for multiple decades and has only recently been more fully exposed. So hopefully with COVID, it doesn't take so long to find the truth. And often there are strains of both the ideological aspect and the corporate interest aspect at play, with corporate interest providing the funding and the support that amplifies ideological positions that are at least somewhat pre-existing in society and are financially convenient for those industries. And then finally, of course, while corporate interests support denial in the climate denial realm, they often advertise themselves to the public as doing the exact opposite, as, for example, as trying to solve the problem. So that's the second lesson. And the third lesson is that these denialist campaigns lose much of their power once their operations are exposed. So that's a hopeful lesson. So for example, the revelation that big oil has been behind a lot of climate denial, even though it previously accepted and understood climate science internally, that has reframed the climate issue. That has created calls for accountability from across the political spectrum, actually, similar with tobacco. So maybe an important question or set of questions for COVID denial going forward is, who's behind COVID denial, who's funding it, if groups are funding it, how much of it is grassroots ideology, how much of it is corporate or plutocratic, just very wealthy people strategizing, which industries and groups benefit, and how much of it is driven by a desire to fight all regulation and all government action. Those are just some questions. And, those are my lessons from climate denial. And I had to do that because I actually don't know a lot about COVID denial. So I'm actually also very interested to hear what the other panelists say. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think that definitely understanding the history can help us a lot moving forward, and, untangling these parallels. So that's super helpful context. Next, I want to introduce Larry Au. He's a PhD candidate in sociology and a Paul F. Lazarsfeld Fellow at Columbia University with broad interests in the sociology of science, knowledge, and technology. His current research examines the politics and social implications of advances in genomics and precision medicine, as well as the public's trust and mistrust of science and the role of expertise during the COVID-19 pandemic. He has an MA in history from Brown University and an MSc in global governance and diplomacy from the University of Oxford.
All right, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Mallory, scientists to speak up for inviting me to this webinar, and thank you all for coming today. I'll be building on some of the themes that Ben brought up in his remarks on the history of climate denial, and I'll talk about two recent studies that I've been part of that touches on expert public relations and science communication during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before diving in, I do want to make a note about terminology. What is denialism, right? I would argue that, like vaccine hesitancy, the concept is somewhat of a catch-all category. It lumps together a wide range of attitudes, behaviors, motivations, and concerns. On the extreme end, you have folks who loudly deny the severity of COVID-19 or even the existence of COVID-19. But there are other positions on the spectrum of sorts. You can see folks who don't deny the severity, but are skeptical about the duration and effectiveness of certain public health interventions, such as lockdowns or outdoor mask use. You have folks who are hesitant or critical about trade-offs of privacy and the adoption of digital contact tracing and public health surveillance. Then you have folks who could be more uncertain or questioning over who to listen to in often vacuous public debates. Then, as Ben pointed out, there are those who are the subject of willful misinformation and or disinformation campaigns from malicious actors. So really, to understand denialism in COVID, how it's formed, as an empirical social scientist, it's useful to look at how these dynamics play out in particular cases and settings. So yeah, in the remainder of my time, I'll talk about two studies I've been part of. The first is a study of an online community of COVID-19 patients, and a second on public health slogans and their mutations in the US, UK, and Brazil. So the first study is a paper that I recently published in Qualitative Sociology with my co-author, Gil Yao. It looks at an online community of COVID-19 patients at the onset of the pandemic. The question that we tried to answer was, at a time of radical uncertainty, when knowledge about COVID-19 was scant, even amongst credentialed experts, how did patients decide between what was credible and uncredible forms of medical advice? In other words, how did patients on this forum learn to become lay experts of COVID-19? To answer this question, we use a mix of computational and qualitative techniques to sort through the many posts on this forum, some over 100,000 posts on this forum. The computational techniques was somewhat useful in characterizing the broad topics of discussions on this forum. People came to this forum to talk about their symptoms, illness experiences, their experience staying at home, their emotional state during isolation, and their difficulties in getting testing and medical care during this chaotic time. But to answer the research question about what was seen as credible or uncredible medical advice, we turn to more good old-fashioned reading of these posts. So we use the like function on this forum, reading the top 1,000 and the bottom 1,000 liked and disliked posts, and comparing across qualitatively across different characteristics. So one of the major findings from this reading exercise was that credential form of expertise, or rather appeals to scientific authority alone, was often seen as not credible by users on this forum. When users told others to just talk to your doctor or just listen to the CDC, these posts were often ignored or disliked. So take, for instance, this exchange between users. I'm not sure if our screen icons are blocking the text, but I'll read parts of it. So yeah, from NYC patient, they're debating how long a patient should, after being diagnosed with COVID, should stay at home. From the CDC, just listen to them. Home isolation for people with COVID-19 can be discontinued if a test is conducted to see if you're contagious, if you have no fever over 72 hours and other symptoms have improved, and at least 7 days have passed since your symptoms first appeared. The second user goes free, says, why are people still believing the CDC and their guidance? They've consistently delivered misleading and reckless advice, as has been disproven, that goes against common sense. And then he goes on to argue for more caution, treat everyone as infected, and act accordingly. The next user says, What are you talking about? The CD is one of the most reliable sources of guidance. The public officials don't listen to them. That's been causing harm. What's misleading or reckless advice have they been delivering? They've been releasing information as they learn more, constantly updating the public with their constantly evolving understanding of the virus. Goes free, retorts, COVID isn't airborne, that was wrong. Don't wear masks, this is wrong. Just wash your hands, this is wrong. Asymptomatic people can't spread virus, this is wrong, and so on. And he says in the end, those blindly following official guidelines and not using their own common sense are endangering everyone. So there's a sentiment on this forum that there is a distrust of credentialed expertise, and there's an appeal to do your own research, a phrase that's widely derided recently. But this is a sentiment that's shared by a lot of users on this forum. So yeah, to overcome this credibility gap, we found that users to dispense credible medical advice had to follow a certain sequence of conversational dynamics. To enter into a conversation and were seen as credible and trustworthy participants, they had to learn to ask questions from other people. They had to learn to share their illness experience and carefully compare across the experience that they had with other people. Slowly then, they learned to generalize beyond their own case and gradually learn to incorporate useful and practical scientific findings frequently found on preprints and newly posted studies in order to bolster their claims. In my remaining time, I'll talk briefly about a second study that me and my co-author, Renan Gonzalez Leonel da Silva, who's at ETH Zurich, conducted comparing the uses and misuses of public health slogans in the US, UK, and Brazil. The study is supported by the Social Science Research Council's Rapid Response Grants for COVID-19 and the social sciences. So to study this, we queried news articles from the top 3 circulating newspapers in these 3 countries from January to June 2020 to look at the invocation of public health slogans that experts and policymakers use to help persuade the public to help fight and mitigate COVID-19 during the initial months of the pandemic. I'm sure you've all heard versions of these slogans in our daily lives: flatten the curve in the US, in the UK, stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, and in Brazil, variations of take care of yourself, stay home, but if you need to go out, wear a mask. It's a little more clunky. So yeah, we're tracing out how these slogans were used, and we found that eventually a lot of lockdown skeptics and COVID denialists took on these slogans as reasons and justifications for why they were advocating against public health measures that these slogans were meant to promote. In other words, even though experts had originally designed these slogans with a certain motivation, these slogans had mutated and were eventually used to justify distrust in need of public health interventions. So for instance, in Brazil, the idea that you have to take care of yourself blended into a discourse over individualized responsibility of the pandemic. We found that a lot of informal sector workers, a lot of small business owners that were quoted in news reports went along this ideological idea that it's up to the individual's choice to take on protections, and it was their responsibility to remain unaffected from COVID-19. In the UK, we found that similarly, a lot of quoted small business owners engage in a sort of a whataboutism, arguing that while the NHS was important, there are also other social institutions that we as a society have to protect, like small businesses, like schools. In the US, the slogan flatten the curve was eventually used by lockdown skeptics to argue that now that the curve has been flattened, we should consider reopening. And again, this was picked up by business owners, but also more in a US case, voices of parents of homeschooled children at that point. So yeah, some quick takeaways from these studies. For experts, there should be some form of epistemic humility that recognizes the limits of expertise, and it should also recognize the feedback loops that fuel uncertainty and doubt, and actively preempt and even pre-bump potential sources of denialism. Yeah, while science is useful in answering a lot of questions that we have about the pandemic, we should also remember that the pandemic is a social and political phenomenon as well too. The priorities that shape science and how science is used should be open to discussion and deliberation. And also a small plug, we're extending these studies into a survey and interviews of long COVID patients. So if you are a long COVID patient, log on to our website here and help take our survey. Yeah, that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're going to hear from one more panelist, and then we'll move into a Q&A session. So feel free to start putting your questions in the chat. So next we're going to hear from Professor Stephen Lewandowski. He is the chair in cognitive science at the University of Bristol. His research examines people's memory, decision-making, and knowledge structures with a particular emphasis on how people update their memories if information they believe turns out to be false. He is particularly interested in the variables that determine whether or not people accept scientific evidence, for example, surrounding vaccinations or climate science. He was appointed a Fellow of the Academy of Social Science and a Fellow of the Association of Psychological Science in 2017. And in 2016, he was appointed a Fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry for his commitment to science, rational inquiry, and public education. So now I'll pass it off to you.
Okay, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and my slides should show up now. Thank you. Well, I want to thank the preceding two panelists for having set the stage perfectly for what I'm going to do now, which is to talk about both climate science and COVID from two angles. One, public opinion, and the other one, the organized denial that Ben has already told us about. Now, to put the whole thing into context, one of the things that everybody talks about, but that we have to recognize at the beginning, is the intense polarization at the moment in the United States between the two parties and partisans. Now, this graph here shows the extent of polarization where Republicans like themselves, but definitely do not like Democrats. Oops, that cursor is very slow. And vice versa, Democrats on the left have very little affection for Republicans. And the extent of that polarization actually exceeds that around race. And you can imagine that that is quite a high bar in the United States to surpass. And not surprisingly, that polarization expresses itself on scientific issues, including, but not limited to, climate change and COVID. Now, if you look at people's attitudes towards science, whatever it may be, the overriding driver of their attitudes is their worldview. That is, whether they're liberal or conservative, whether they view the world as being egalitarian or hierarchical. There is a number of ways to express this fundamental underlying tension between conservatism and libertarianism on the one hand and liberal egalitarianism on the other. And just to illustrate, this is a fairly recent study that was done in 24 countries looking at people's climate attitudes. And what you see in this graph are the strengths of association between, on the one hand, conservatism and climate denial on the other. And what you can see is that, especially in the United States, these effects are massive. They're large across all 5 English-speaking nations examined here, so Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, US, but they also persist across the entire ensemble of countries. So in climate science, there's no question that political attitude or worldviews predisposes people's rejection of the science. Now, the same has been found recently relating to COVID. In fact, you can tie votes for Trump in 2016 to the extent of compliance with social distancing across US counties, and you can even trace that then into infection rates and fatalities. Now, the question is why? Now, one possibility is that, of course, in both cases, climate change and COVID, doing something about it, whatever way you will choose to do it, interferes with current practice and people's individual choices. There's just no way around that. COVID, before the vaccines, was only controllable through behavioral measures. And mitigating climate change will require some change to our economy. So you can't just let it all go as it is. Therefore, from a libertarian perspective that emphasizes individual choice and freedom, the solutions to both crises are in conflict with those worldviews, and solution aversion has been identified as a mediator, as a predictor of climate denial, where the aversion comes from worldviews that then ultimately turns into denial. But now here's the problem. At some point, you then wonder, well, hang on, what is going on with vaccinations, COVID-19 vaccinations? They're our ticket out of the pandemic. So what's going on here? If it's all about freedom and restoring your freedom, shouldn't conservatives embrace vaccinations? Well, they don't. And this is, at first glance, a very interesting phenomenon. What I'm showing you here are data for the United States, color-coded by voting record in the 2020 election. The more red, the more Trump, the more blue, the more Biden. And on the right hand, what I'm showing you is vaccine uptake, which is far higher in Democratic states than in red states. And on the left, correspondingly, but of course it goes the other way, I'm plotting vaccine hesitancy. In other words, people's reluctance to take vaccines. And you again find this overriding effect of ideology on people's attitudes and behaviors. But why? If it's all about freedom and libertarianism, shouldn't you welcome a vaccination so you can walk out and do your thing as before? Well, this is where I think we have to switch from public attitudes to asking, where do they come from? And Ben made the point. Sometimes, ideology is kind of a cover for financial interests. I would agree with that, but I would add that ideology is often exploited by organized denial in the interests of underlying financial vested interests. So there's a whole, hours of lecturing that I could now turn to about how denial takes place. I want to focus on just one thing that has been used forever, since tobacco and, the 1950s, and that is that vested interests and organized denial will resort to various tools to manufacture doubt, the famous book by Oreskes and Conway. And they do that with, smiling doctors on tobacco ads in the 1960s and 70s, claiming that, don't worry about smoking Luckies because they're toasted. In climate change, they did a similar thing by having petitions that created the appearance of a scientific debate, when in fact there is none. There's no scientific debate about the fundamentals of climate change and the fact that we cause it. And now in COVID-19, we have similar efforts underway where the existing uncertainty, scientific uncertainty, has been exploited by some people to create a debate, or at least to amplify a debate. My favorite example is the so-called Great Barrington Declaration, which my understanding has a local connection to Stanford here, as indeed do some of these other climate denial things. And this Great Barrington Declaration was widely condemned by the WHO as being unethical and a travesty and all that. But basically that said, oh, well, don't worry about COVID. Let's not have a lockdown. Let's just let it rip through the population. Oh, and we'll protect the old people somehow. But they never really specified how they would do that. So, but that was all based on petitions and the appearance of creating a debate. And as John Massey has already put in the Q&A, there is a connection here between those two things, between climate change and COVID. Namely, it's the same people who are engaged in creating the appearance of a debate where there is none, or creating a debate in the light of uncertainty that could have been avoided otherwise. And this is just one example. AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research, which sounds so scientific, doesn't it? But it's just a front group for conservative and right-wing interests. And it's the same people who have been instrumental in creating fake petitions suggesting there is a debate in climate change where there is none, and now creating this fairly artificial division in the scientific community over COVID-19. And it doesn't stop there. We also have organized efforts to take the vaccines, and instead of saying that's our ticket to freedom, they're rebranding the freedom now, and basically are inverting it to say, well, you know, you should have the choice not to take the vaccine, which at first glance has some validity, I suppose. But of course, what it is ignoring is that your decision not to have a vaccine affects everybody else. It affects your grandparents, it affects the rest of society, and you're denying them the freedom by not getting vaccinated. And that link, of course, is getting lost there. So I think, to sum it all up, it's a very complicated story, but in a nutshell, there is an underlying organized anti-government, anti-science structure in the United States that is well-funded to the tune of, I think, $1 billion a year, according to Robert Brully. John Massey will know the number to 3 digits. That is trying to undermine science and government wherever it rears its head or is trying to do something. So what can we do about this? Well, I don't have time to get into the details, and that's okay, because I did have time to write a few handbooks together with colleagues over the last few years that are all publicly available. I just popped the links in the chat that contain pointers to how we can deal with this, ranging from the specifics of COVID-19 vaccinations to debunking more generally, and importantly, a context I didn't have time to touch on, the whole relationship and tension between online technologies and social media architectures and democracy itself, which I think is a much bigger topic than I have time for, but it's worth pointing to. So thank you for your attention, and I do look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. So now we're going to get started with the Q&A, and I'm going to take a bit of moderator's privilege and ask the first question. And I want to specifically talk a little bit about the role of scientists in all of this. So denialism is sometimes seen as anti-science, but these coordinated denialist campaigns will often recruit scientists to spread their messages. So how do you reconcile this? What is the importance of scientists to these efforts? So why are they trying to get scientists? And then what motivates the scientists generally? Is it financial or is it something else? So a few questions there, and anyone can feel free to jump in.
Sure, I can jump in on that. I think the role of the scientist is very important. As you mentioned, often, if you want to call it denialist campaign, although that's kind of a flat term, but they do operate through finding scientist spokespeople who can communicate that message and create that appearance of equal weight on both sides. So, I mean, that is very important. Understanding the sociology of the scientific community around an issue and communicating that to the public has been important. For example, with Naomi Oreskes, her work on climate and measuring the consensus around climate change. It's very important. I think it's also important, and I speak now as a historian of science, to recognize that some distrust, some skepticism of the scientific establishment is valid. It's logical. I mean, many of the substances that we view as, toxic or poisonous today were at some point in time thought to be, totally healthy and widely used and endorsed by the scientific community. But I was just in a presentation about DDT yesterday. That's just one good example of that. And, for many people, they're not close to the scientific community. They're not working as a scientist. they might not know working scientists either. So that community can feel far away from them personally. And so it might be easier to distrust that community for that reason. So, I think that all of that says that scientists play an important role in humanizing the community, in communicating to people about the issue, bridging that divide. And I think that sometimes there is a temptation to sort of say to someone, well, you're just uneducated, you don't understand science, you don't believe in science. It's sort of a kind of intellectually authoritarian response. And I've never really seen that work well, I guess personally, at least, just speaking personally. So all of that, I don't know if I answered the question, but those are just some thoughts on, the role of scientists. I mean, they're clearly very, very important in all of this.
Does anyone else want to jump in?
Well, yeah, just to build on that, I mean, Ben is absolutely right. Telling people that they're too stupid to understand the science is not a winning proposition. We should never do that. Of course not. But there are things we can do that are getting the message across. So, for example, in climate change and also in vaccination communication, actually, it's been shown that if you inform people about the scientific consensus on that issue, that is raising the acceptance of science. Now, again, you can do that wrongly or you can do that correctly. And if you do it correctly by just saying, hey, on the basis of working on this and independently evaluating the evidence, 97 out of 100 climate scientists agree on the fundamentals, which is in fact, that used to be the right number. I think it's now gone up to about 99 out of 100. That is valuable information for the public, in particular in an environment where that has been denied itself. One of the favored techniques of climate deniers is to claim there's no scientific consensus. That's the number one topic in op-eds that are questioning climate science. And the moment you let that happen, you're actually denying the public the right to be informed about the risks they're facing. And I think you are totally entitled in restoring that right by saying, oh, guys, no. It's 99 out of 100 that agree. So that is we've got a lot of evidence on that suggesting that works. And I think it's absolutely legitimate to do that. And there's also other stuff, but I think Larry wants to add something.
Yeah, I was adding my 2 cents, but yeah, there's a lot of things that scientists can do to speak up, right? Having organizations such as this, having webinars like this definitely helps. But there's a lot more that I think that scientific professional organizations, and there's a shortage of those, can do to actively promote and explain how certain members in their communities or their fields are perhaps more fringe figures, or perhaps people that are not deserving as high praise or credibility as they may appear to be. And yeah, there's also things that scientific journals can do to make their research a lot more accessible, right? And there's a lot more movements right now to have like accompanying like blog posts or videos or even like social media outreach for a lot of scientific journals. So all these things can also help bridge the gap in terms of explaining what a study says, what its implications are, and so on. And of course, there's also more like good old-fashioned things like conflicts of interest declarations, making those more accessible, more timely, more public. So things like that. But also a word of caution in the process of, I guess, ostracizing certain members of the scientific community, it's also remember that skepticism and dissent in the field is important. So in balancing these things, there is some sort of a trade-off to be made.
Thank you so much. So now I'll ask one more of my questions and then we'll go into the Q&A, but keep putting your questions in the Q&A. Ben talked a little bit about the importance of uncovering the underlying agendas and teasing out the ideological aims and financial interests. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about how that work is actually conducted. And then since it takes a while to do that, how, and you've kind of already touched on this, but how to respond to these types of campaigns in real time to effectively counter their reach?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It was something I wrote down just now. The temporal dynamics of COVID compared to climate change, in some ways they're different. You know, we're uncovering things about climate denial from 20 years ago or 30 years ago that, you know, of course, are still relevant today because the problem, what happened 30 years ago still affects us today, of course. And with COVID, there might be, you know, different temporal dynamics that may change from year to year. So that suggests that maybe the way to approach this or study it, one, it certainly just seems more urgent on its face, in a sense, because the situation seems to change more quickly. But maybe the goal, maybe it's a more fast reaction type research, if that's the right term for it, to kind of keep things on track or something like that. But I think it does seem to be different. And, you know, as for uncovering the financial interests that maybe be supporting some of this, with climate denial, there were some obvious suspects, and there were some early reports. Some journalists in the 90s talked about the malign influence of the oil and gas companies on climate negotiations, but they were largely ignored, those journalists. I think it was seen as too much of a, almost like a left-wing conspiracy type of idea. And only within the last, decade has there been all of this documentary discovery, essentially, through archival research and other types of investigation that have shown, oh, actually, this is a very extensive industry-run effort. So with COVID, I'm sort of just guessing here. I mean, clearly things like the lockdowns had a major economic effect on numerous sectors in the society, from airlines to, the restaurant industry to, various things. I'm just sort of guessing here, but, there are obviously financial interests that are implicated in the government response. And then sometimes there are groups that you just didn't expect to be part of it. And they got on board anyway. With climate denial, I mean, one of the early climate denial groups, I was surprised to see IBM on there. I was surprised to see Eastman Kodak on there. They had their own reasons, apparently, or maybe they just wanted to keep an eye on things and wanted to be part of this group. But sometimes there are unexpected actors as well. So how do you do it? Kind of any way that you can. I think that's not a very good answer, but you interview people, you talk to people, you try to find documents, I think all of that. You try to get leaked stuff, leaked presentations, however you can. And the good news is usually when you get a little bit, it's easier to find more because then you kind of understand the shape of it a bit more. But there might, so I mean, one approach would be to just gather everything that's been done about COVID denial so far and try to see what is understood about it, in general. And I'm sure the other panelists have a lot of knowledge about that, I imagine. And, you just sort of go from there. And that's sort of not a great answer, but I think that's the way it's done in a way. You take every lead you possibly have, you can get, and you go from there.
Yeah, I agree that is taking a lot of time, and rightfully so, because you got to do the research. Now, I would argue that there is, however, a faster time scale that you can apply. Certainly now you can, not in the past, but now you can. And that is by monitoring social media and Twitter and all these sources. And, you try and figure out where is all this stuff where is it coming from? And we now have reasonably good techniques to identify large, coordinated, inauthentic activity on Twitter. And of course, when you apply these techniques, then you can pinpoint, Where's all this anti-vax information coming from? Ah, okay, it's right-wing think tanks plus Russia Today plus whatever, the usual suspects. So I think there is a faster time scale available to us now to do that. The other thing that's available to us is that we have knowledge of the argumentation and techniques that people use who are arguing against scientific evidence. Because if the evidence is clear, as it is in climate change, and in some aspects also in COVID, not everywhere, there's more uncertainty, but some things are utterly clear, then by definition, if you want to oppose that evidence and deny it, you're going to have to say something that's just pretty crazy, right? And there's been a lot of analysis done on the argumentation by denialists. And if you do a proper blind test on that argumentation and their interpretation of data, you find that people who don't know what this is about, hence it's a blind test, they're identifying the denialist arguments as just being unsuitable. And, they're just not valid. They're contradicting themselves. They're incoherent. They're cherry picking. And so the moment you know about that general playbook of denial, you can detect it even without knowing what the evidence is. Because if somebody walks up to you and says, hey, you know what? You can't measure global temperature because the thermometers are too unreliable. And then they turn around and they say, oh yeah, but by the way, don't worry about it. It's been cooling for the last 18 years, right? Well, hang on, wait a minute. If you don't know how to measure temperature, how do you know it's been cooling? That's just incoherent. You can't say that. And so you can instantly pick out somebody who's not making a scientific argument, because that's just, ridiculous. And the moment you have that skill, it's actually quite, it's less confusing than it would be otherwise. And we have evidence, growing evidence, that it is possible to teach people how to spot different arguments and sources of low credibility. There's, in fact, Sam Weinberg is at Stanford in education doing some amazing work on something called lateral reading, which is teaching high school kids how to identify trustworthy sources on the internet. And the key thing is you don't look at the source itself, what they have to say about themselves. No, you open a lot of other tabs and search for that source elsewhere, Snopes or the New York Times or Google or Wikipedia. It doesn't really matter where. If it's a dodgy source, it'll be flagged everywhere else as, a front group. And so there are ways in which we can teach kids and the public to become a little more resilient to misinformation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it over to Larry now with a question from the chat. From Julia, do you think it's better for scientists to provide more nuanced messages about public health related matters, even if they are more difficult for people to understand and may not come across as strongly? If so, what are your thoughts on how to do this effectively?
Sam, that's a great question, but also a very tough question, right? For COVID, as been pointed out, the temporal dynamics are very different from climate change communication. So it isn't just a matter of talking about public health, but it's also about communicating science in the making. So science that's not settled, and there isn't so much of a consensus just yet. So yeah, I think for that, there are probably some guidelines that could be useful for communicating with the public. One of them, I think, as I pointed out at the end of the presentation, is being open about the limitations of what the experts know, what they don't know, and the limits of expertise, right? There's a lot of questions that science can answer right now, and there's a lot of things that we're still waiting and seeing to figure out. So commuting that and revising guidelines, revising things. There's experiments in science communications journals that have shown that even if you revise your guidelines later on, the public still tends to trust you if you give them a good reason and if you're transparent about that process of revising your guidelines. I think you also should be open towards different types of knowledge that can be useful. At the beginning of the pandemic, there's a lot of experts in Asia, East Asia, that were more experienced of dealing about airborne pathogens at the beginning, talking about mass use that were not as listened to as their colleagues in the US. So yeah, being open to not just published science, but also experiential judgment and expert judgment, right? But yeah, like in the end, a lot of these like public health guidelines are not just scientific decisions, they're also political and social decisions, right? So it's hard to say that scientists should be making all the decisions. So yeah, like in the process of using the science in the process of policymaking, being open towards how and why certain decisions are made should also be more transparent.
Thanks so much. And next, we're going to do another question from the chat from Justin Feldman. So I'm interested in the division between hard denialism and soft denialism, where soft denialism accepts that these phenomena are real, but it downplays the urgency or severity. Soft denialism also seems more mainstream. So what can we do about it?
I'll give it a quick go, but I think Ben may have more to say about that. I think it's obviously a real problem because it's far more effective politically if you're a lukewarmer, quote unquote, in climate change. You say, oh yeah, it's happening, it's our fault. Yeah, it's not that great, but let's not worry about it too much. That's a much harder nut to crack than hardcore denial. Although I would argue that you still have to deal with the hardcore denial in just to clean up the conversation before you talk about soft denial. When it comes to soft denial, the debate is far more political in nature, I think, than it is about differentiating science from nonsense, because some of the lukewarm arguments are very misleading and they spin the hell out of everything, but they're at least not denying gravity. They're not, it's a different class of people. And that becomes a much more, to my mind, a much more political process in convincing people that, well, actually, the risk is far, far greater than what these people are saying. And that's a slightly different kind of level of rhetoric, at least to me. Ben, what do you think? You're immersed in this more than me, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a really important question because sometimes we do fixate on science denial per se, like saying climate change isn't real or something. But often, in the case of climate change, one can accept the existence of climate change while, continuing to make the problem worse, of course, or opposing measures to deal with it. So, that has been a huge issue in the climate case. In fact, just to get into the detail a little bit, in 1989, there was an internal Exxon strategy memo that talked about the various sub-strategies that the company would implement in order to fight regulation of fossil fuels. One of them was emphasize uncertainty, which is basically, to litigate the science itself, engage in science denial. But that was just one of many strategies. Others were emphasize the cost of action, promote solutions that would basically distract from the industry and deflect basically industry-friendly solutions that actually wouldn't solve the problem, things like that. So in that history, we saw the fossil fuel industry promoting outright climate denial for actually less than about a decade or so, until about 97 or 98. Then they dropped that largely, but maintained the other components of that larger strategy, which continue today. So, with COVID, I don't know what the analogy would be. I think with climate, it's like accepting climate science, but downplaying the urgency of the problem or the severity of the threat. And of course, impeding efforts to address the problem. With COVID, it might be, accepting the reality of it on some level, but, opposing measures or downplaying the severity of the problem, things like that. So I think it is important to recognize that. And in climate, that soft denial has been, it's been helpful to identify, what interests are served by soft denial and which are not, in order to make it clear, that soft denial has an impact, that there are stakes to it, high stakes, in fact. And so with COVID, maybe something similar, identify who benefits and who loses by, treating the issue in a more, nonchalant way. That might be a start, at least, for addressing that.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think we have time for maybe 2 more quick questions. So the first one is, how do you navigate scenarios where expertise is politicized or turns out to be wrong?
Yeah, I mean, that comes up, in the chat everywhere. How can I trust these people because they changed their mind? Basically, they first said don't wear masks, now they say do. Well, I think the answer is precisely because they changed their mind on the basis of new evidence that you should trust them. The people who never change their mind on anything are the people who, oppose climate change or vaccinations, because whatever you tell them, whatever the evidence is, they will always be, denying that. I mean, that's the essence of denial. The essence of science is to be responsive to evidence. Now, that sometimes means that we have to modify provisional knowledge. Although, if you look at the evolution of COVID and how that's happened there, I think some of these changes are a little bit exaggerated, because the advice on masks from early on was, yes, healthcare professionals who are interacting closely with patients have to have masks, but the rest of us who are just walking past some dude on the street, we don't have to worry about it. Well, as it turns out, in particular now that we have new variants that have evolved that are much more transmissible, the advice necessarily has to be different. But that doesn't mean that the early advice was wrong. It was just that at the time, the original COVID was less transmissible. And it also wasn't immediately clear that it could be, I mean, there's a subtle distinction between aerosols and it was always airborne, but not necessarily as far from the speaker as we now know that it can be transmitted. There were subtleties that we didn't know, but I think sometimes the change in advice is exaggerated. And it's also the case that a lot of the advice has been invariant. Social distancing and cutting down on interactions, of course, will reduce transmissibility. I mean, how else could an infectious disease? Yeah, it's an infectious disease. There's your answer. You stay at home, you're not going to get infected. So, I think there's some exaggeration of how scientists have changed their mind, but equally, the fact that they do is telling you that they're listening to the evidence.
Awesome, thank you. And so I'm just gonna do one more question. I know we're going a little bit over time because we're just having so much fun and I could talk about this forever. So I wanted to ask all of our panelists, just in a couple of sentences, what you hope the people who are here today will remember about these issues moving forward and how they can respond effectively.
You better point at somebody, otherwise we're all going to be so polite. We'll be here for another 5 minutes.
Why don't we go in the order that you presented in? And you can also just point them to a resource.
Sure. So thanks. I think it's really important to have these discussions. I think my main message is that these dynamics of denial or delay in climate might be delay, and in COVID, it might be downplay. They are understandable, they're comprehensible. And once you understand the details, they're often not as complicated as it first appears. They might be sophisticated with many moving parts, but not hard to understand once you know some of the details about it. And they're overcomable. We've seen that in various examples historically. They are overcomable. It sometimes takes time to do that, but these are all eminently understandable and addressable issues. And I think that's my main message.
Along those lines, denialism, skepticism, comes in a wide range of spectrums of attitudes and motivations. Understanding that isn't hard. You just have to talk to people. You just have to read what they're saying online. And yeah, you can start to address some of their concerns. Sometimes these concerns are justified, sometimes they're not. But there are ways to tackle misinformation or misinformation in certain cases, right? And yeah, experts have their limits. We don't expect scientists to solve everything, but they're part of a community, right? And they can work together with historians, of investigative journalists to figure out what's right and what's wrong.
Okay, wow. I mean, I've talked so much. All that's left for me to do is just, download that handbook, and then you'll know how to talk to people. But yeah, seriously, I think, what Larry has said in particular, that there's a whole range of different, from skepticism to questioning to denial, we got to recognize that lots of different people having lots of different reasons for having these opinions, sometimes very good reasons. If you're dependent on an hourly wage, lockdowns are killing you. You're not going to eat if you can't go to work, if you don't have a regular salary. So you have to understand people's lived experience, why they might reject public health measures. I think that's absolutely crucial. That doesn't make their argumentation correct, but it means that we have to treat them with a great deal of respect and understanding. And that's very important to point out.
And I'll say, if you are at Stanford, you should join Scientists Speak Up and participate in our programming around these issues. And next week, we're going to have a follow-up workshop on how to respond to misinformation effectively, which we're working on in partnership with folks in the School of Education. So really excited for that. And thank you to everyone who came today. The recording will be made available and public, so feel free to share it. And thanks to everyone who came today, and another big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all so much.